The charcoal pencil moved across the weathered sketchbook with practiced precision, capturing the distant ranch that sprawled across the valley like a promise of something permanent in this untamed land. And Mariah Zimmerman hadn't expected anyone to notice her sitting on this ridge in the early morning light of 1878. She had been traveling through Utah Territory for 3 weeks now, her wagon breaking down just outside Parowan 2 days prior. While the blacksmith worked on the wheel axle, Mariah found herself drawn to the surrounding landscape with an artist's hunger. The ranch below caught her attention immediately, the way the wooden buildings seemed to grow naturally from the red earth. The corrals perfectly positioned to catch morning shade. The gardens that spoke of careful cultivation rather than mere survival. Everything about it whispered of someone who understood this land, who worked with it instead of against it. The sun climbed higher as she sketched, her fingers smudged with charcoal, her blonde hair escaping its pins in the dry breeze. She didn't hear the horse approaching until it was nearly upon her, hooves crunching against the rocky soil. "That's a fine perspective you've got from up here," a deep voice said, startling her so badly she nearly dropped her sketchbook. Mariah turned to find a man on horseback, tall even in the saddle, with dark hair touched with copper in the sunlight and eyes the color of sage after rain. He wore dusty work clothes and a battered hat, and there was something about the way he sat his horse that suggested complete comfort in his own skin. He couldn't have been much older than 30, perhaps 28 or 29 to her own 23 years. "I apologize," she said quickly, feeling heat rush to her cheeks. "I didn't mean to trespass," or he held up a hand, and she noticed the calluses, the weathered strength of someone who worked with his hands. "You're not trespassing. This ridge is public land. I'm just curious what about my ranch caught your eye enough to sketch it." His ranch. Mariah looked down at her drawing, then back at him, mortification flooding through her. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I should have asked permission before sketching something from public land." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his somewhat stern features into something warmer. "I think you're safe from legal action. I'm Lucas Reeves, Mariah Zimmerman." She closed her sketchbook, but he gestured toward it. "May I?" She hesitated, then handed it over. Artists were always vulnerable when showing their work, but there was something about his genuine interest that made her trust him. Lucas dismounted with easy grace and stood beside her, studying the sketch with an attention that made her nervous. "You've got the angle of the main barn exactly right," he said finally. "Most people wouldn't notice how it's positioned to block the worst of the winter wind. And you captured the garden that's my mother's pride, though she passed 2 years ago. My sister Sarah maintains it now." He looked up at her. "You're not from around here, Kansas," Mariah said. "I was traveling to California to stay with my aunt, but my wagon broke down in Parowan. The blacksmith says it will be another 2 days before the part arrives from Cedar City. Wagon traveling alone." Something shifted in his expression, concern replacing casual interest. "I had a guide, but he took off with most of my money 3 days outside of Kansas." The admission still stung, though she'd reported it to the sheriff in Parowan. "I have enough left to pay for the repairs and make it to California if I'm careful." Lucas was quiet for a moment, looking between her and the sketch. Then he did something she didn't expect. "Come closer." "I'm sorry," he gestured down at the ranch spread below them. "Come down to the ranch. You're seeing it from a distance, capturing what it looks like from the outside. But if you're going to draw it proper, you should see it from the inside too. Draw your life here too, even if it's just for a couple of days while you wait for your wagon." Mariah stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I couldn't possibly impose. It's not an imposition. We've got a spare room in the main house where Sarah stays, and she'd probably appreciate the female company. I'm in the foreman's cabin anyway." He flipped through a few more pages of her sketchbook, and she saw him pause at her drawings of Parowan's Main Street, of the children playing near the general store, of an old woman hanging laundry with gnarled but capable hands. "You've got real talent, Miss Zimmerman. And I think you see things most people miss. Why would you invite a stranger to your home?" The question came out more suspicious than she intended, but she'd learned caution on the trail. Lucas handed back her sketchbook, his expression serious. "Because anyone who draws the world the way you do isn't someone who means harm. And because I remember what it's like to feel stuck in a strange place with limited options. My family came out here in '68 when I was 18. We had nothing but a land claim and determination. People helped us when they didn't have to. I figure I ought to pass that forward when I can." The sincerity in his voice made something in Mariah's chest tighten. She'd been managing on her own since her father died 6 months ago, since her stepmother made it clear Mariah was no longer welcome in what had been her childhood home. The journey west had been one obstacle after another, and she'd grown so used to viewing everyone with suspicion that genuine kindness felt almost foreign. "I don't want to be a burden to your sister," she said carefully. "Sarah's 21 and runs most of the household operations while I handle the cattle and horses. Trust me, she'd be thrilled to have someone new to talk to. We don't get much company out here except during roundup." He swung back into his saddle. "Come on down. Bring your wagon if the blacksmith will let you borrow it for the day, or ride behind me if you need to. Sarah's making her famous biscuits this morning, and I guarantee they're worth the trip." Mariah found herself nodding before she'd fully decided, drawn by the warmth in his invitation and the curious hunger to see up close what she'd been sketching from afar. "I have a room at the boarding house in town. I can gather my things and my art supplies. I'll escort you back to town then, and we'll collect everything." Lucas reached down, offering his hand. "Unless you'd rather walk the 3 miles, she took his hand, and he pulled her up behind him with surprising ease. Mariah had to wrap her arms around his waist to keep her balance, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt, the subtle tension of muscle as he guided the horse down the ridge. She clutched her sketchbook against his back and tried not to think about how this was the closest she'd been to a man since before her father died, how strange and not entirely unwelcome it felt. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the morning sun warming Mariah's shoulders. The landscape around them was beautiful in its starkness: red rocks and scrub brush, distant mountains still capped with snow even in late May, endless sky that made her feel simultaneously tiny and infinite. "What made you want to draw the ranch?" Lucas asked as they descended into the valley. "The way it looked settled," Mariah said honestly. "Everything I've seen since leaving Kansas has felt temporary, like it could blow away in the next dust storm. But your ranch looked like it belongs there, like it grew out of the earth itself. I wanted to capture that feeling." She felt him nod. "That's what my father always said he wanted to build, something permanent. He didn't live to see it finished, but I think he'd be pleased with how it turned out." There was old grief in his voice, the kind that had been worn smooth by time but never fully disappeared. "When did you lose him?" 5 years ago. Influenza swept through one winter, took him and my youngest brother." Lucas's shoulders tensed slightly beneath her grip. "Sarah and I nearly lost the ranch that next year, couldn't manage the cattle operation and the planting both. But we figured it out, hired some good men, and built it back up. That must have been incredibly difficult." It was, but giving up would have meant letting go of everything my father worked for, and I couldn't do that. He glanced back at her. "What about you? What made you decide to head to California?" Mariah chose her words carefully. "My father passed last November. My stepmother remarried quickly, and her new husband made it clear I wasn't part of their
This story was
plans.
posted on the
My aunt
channel
in
The Rusty
Sacramento
Saddle.
offered
Please
me a
do not
place to
repost it
stay,
in any
a
form.
chance to start fresh. That's rough. I'm sorry. The simple sympathy in his words was more comforting than elaborate condolences would have been. They rode through Parowan's Main Street, past the general store and the small church, stopping at the boarding house where Mariah had taken a room. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, raised her eyebrows when Mariah explained she'd be staying at the Reeves Ranch while her wagon was being repaired. But Lucas's presence seemed to alleviate any concern about propriety. The Reeves family is good people, Mrs. Henderson said, helping Mariah gather her belongings. Sarah's a sweet girl, very accomplished. You'll be in good hands, dear. Mariah packed her few dresses, her art supplies, and the small wooden box that held her mother's letters and her father's watch. Everything she owned in the world fit into 2 bags, and her art satchel. The realization would have been depressing if she let herself think about it too long. Lucas secured her bags to his saddle, then helped her up behind him again. As they rode out of town toward the ranch, Mariah noticed how people nodded to Lucas, how children waved, how the man at the livery stable called out a friendly greeting. He was respected here, part of the community's fabric. The ride to the ranch took nearly an hour. As they drew closer, Mariah could see details she'd missed from her distant perch, the vegetable garden bursting with early growth. The chicken coop painted a cheerful red. The way the main house had a wide porch perfect for catching evening breezes. Horses grazed in a nearby pasture, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. Everything spoke of care and attention, of someone who took pride in their work. A young woman emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She had the same dark hair as Lucas, though hers had warm auburn tones, and her face lit up with curiosity when she saw Mariah. "Lucas, you didn't mention you were bringing home a guest," she called out, a teasing note in her voice. "Didn't know I was until an hour ago," Lucas replied, dismounting and helping Mariah down. "Sarah, this is Miss Mariah Zimmerman. She's waiting for her wagon to be repaired in town, and I thought she might appreciate some company and a chance to sketch the ranch from a better angle." "Mariah, my sister Sarah." Sarah's face brightened with genuine pleasure. "Oh, how wonderful! We hardly ever have visitors. Please come in. I just pulled biscuits from the oven and there's fresh butter and honey." She took Mariah's hand with warm friendliness. "Don't let my brother's serious face fool you. He's actually quite pleased to have someone new to talk to, even if he won't admit it." "I talk plenty," Lucas protested, grabbing Mariah's bags. "To horses and cattle," Sarah shot back with obvious affection. "Come on, Miss Zimmerman. Let me show you around." The inside of the house was as well maintained as the outside, with wooden floors worn smooth by years of use and windows that let in generous light. The kitchen was the heart of it, with a large table that could seat 8, a modern cast iron stove, and shelves lined with preserved foods and herbs. Photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace, a stern-looking man with Lucas's eyes, a woman with Sarah's smile, children in various stages of growth. "This was your parents?" Mariah asked, drawn to a wedding portrait. "Yes," Sarah said softly. "Married in 1855 in Missouri before things got too difficult there. Father always wanted to go west, start something of his own. Mother followed him anywhere." She touched the frame gently. "They had a good marriage. I hope to be as lucky someday." Lucas cleared his throat. "I'll put Miss Zimmerman's things in the guest room." "Thank you," Mariah said, but he was already heading down the hallway. Sarah grinned. "He gets uncomfortable when I talk about marriage. Afraid I'll leave him to run this place alone, I think, though he'd never admit it." Now, Sit down and let me feed you properly. You look like you haven't had a decent meal in days." It was true, though Mariah hadn't wanted to admit it. She'd been rationing her limited funds, eating sparingly at the boarding house. But as Sarah piled her plate with fluffy biscuits, scrambled eggs, bacon, and sliced tomatoes from the greenhouse, Mariah felt her mouth water. "This is too generous," she protested weakly. "Nonsense. We have plenty and you're our guest." Sarah sat down across from her with her own plate. "Now, Lucas mentioned you're an artist. I'd love to see your work if you're willing to share." Over breakfast, Mariah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't since leaving Kansas. Sarah was easy to talk to, curious without being intrusive, and she had a quick sense of humor that kept the conversation lively. When Lucas returned, he sat at the head of the table with his coffee and listened more than he spoke, but Mariah noticed how his eyes tracked their conversation, how he smiled slightly when Sarah made her laugh. "So what do you need to do today?" Sarah asked her brother as she cleared the plates. "Check the fence line in the north pasture, work with that new stallion, go over the books." Lucas stretched, his shirt pulling tight across his shoulders. The usual, "Why?" "Because Mariah should see the ranch properly, and I thought you might show her around before you get too busy." "I have preserving to do this morning anyway, or I'd take her myself." Lucas met Mariah's eyes, a question in his expression. "Would you like that? I can show you the operation, and you can sketch whatever catches your interest." "I don't want to interrupt your work," Mariah said, even as anticipation fluttered through her. "You won't be. Most of what I need to do can accommodate an observer." He stood, setting his cup in the wash basin. "Grab your sketchbook and whatever else you need. Wear sturdy shoes if you have them. We'll be walking quite a bit." Mariah hurried to the guest room, a cozy space with a window overlooking the garden and a quilt-covered bed that looked infinitely more comfortable than the boarding house cot. She changed into her most practical dress, pulled her hair back securely, and gathered her art supplies with trembling fingers. This felt like opportunity, though for what she wasn't entirely sure yet. Lucas was waiting on the porch, his hat shading his eyes. He'd strapped on a holster with a well-worn revolver, and when he noticed her looking at it, he shrugged. "Rattlesnakes, mostly. Sometimes coyotes get bold, nothing to worry about." They started with the barn, and Mariah was impressed by how organized everything was. Tack hung neatly on the walls, hay was stacked in precise bales, and the stalls were mucked clean. 3 ranch hands were working when they entered, and they tipped their hats respectfully to Mariah while exchanging easy banter with Lucas. "This is Miss Zimmerman," Lucas introduced her. "She's a guest for a few days. Mariah, this is Tom, Vicent, and Jack. They keep this place running as much as Sarah and I do." The men seemed curious but friendly, and Mariah appreciated how Lucas included them in the conversation as he checked on various tasks. It was clear he respected the people who worked for him, that this was a partnership rather than a hierarchy based on power alone. Lucas led her to the corrals next, where a beautiful black stallion paced along the fence line. "That's Midnight. Bought him 3 weeks ago from a breeder in Cedar City. He's got excellent lines but needs training before he's reliable." "He's magnificent," Mariah breathed, already reaching for her sketchbook. "He knows it too, arrogant as they come." But there was affection in Lucas's voice. He climbed the fence with easy athleticism and spent the next 20 minutes working with the horse, his movements patient and confident. Mariah sketched rapidly, capturing the interplay between man and animal, the way Lucas's body language communicated as clearly as words, the gradual softening of the stallion's resistance. When Lucas finally climbed back over the fence, there was sweat on his brow and satisfaction in his expression. "He's coming along. Another few weeks and he'll be ready. You're good with him, Mariah observed. Horses respond to consistency and respect, same as people. He
This
wiped his
story was
face with his
posted on the
sleeve.
channel The Rusty
Want to see the
Saddle. Please
garden?
do not
Sarah
repost it in
grows
any
most of what
form.
we eat, and she's built up quite an operation. The garden was impressive, especially for this arid climate. Sarah had constructed an irrigation system that channeled water from a nearby creek, and everything grew in neat rows: tomatoes, squash, beans, peas, potatoes, carrots, herbs. Beyond the vegetables was a small orchard with young fruit trees just beginning to bud. This represents years of work, Lucas said, pride evident in his voice. When we first arrived, nothing would grow. The soil was too alkaline, the water too scarce. But Sarah studied, experimented, composted, and slowly transformed this plot into something productive. She's remarkable, though she'd never say so herself. Mariah sketched the garden, moved by the dedication it represented. You must have been quite young when you came here. 18, you said. Just barely. Sarah was 11 and my brother Daniel was 14. It was hard those first years. We lived in a one-room cabin, barely had enough food, fought the weather and the isolation. My father worked himself nearly to death trying to make the ranch succeed, and my mother supported him even when it seemed impossible. He was quiet for a moment. They never lost faith that it would work out. I try to remember that when things get difficult now. Do you ever wish you'd chosen something easier? Mariah asked. Lucas considered the question seriously. Sometimes, especially during the worst times when we were scraping by on almost nothing and the future looked bleak. But then I'll see a sunrise over the valley, or watch a colt take its first steps, or taste Sarah's preserves made from our own fruit, and I remember why we're here. This is ours. We built it with our own hands from nothing. That means something. The passion in his voice stirred something in Mariah's chest. She'd been drifting since her father died, carried along by circumstances rather than making active choices. Listening to Lucas talk about purpose and permanence made her realize how much she missed having roots, belonging somewhere. They walked the property for hours, Lucas explaining his plans for expansion, pointing out where he wanted to build another barn, discussing water rights and grazing rotation with an enthusiasm that was contagious. Mariah filled pages with sketches of the landscape, the buildings, the animals, and increasingly, Lucas himself. She captured him examining fence posts, studying the horizon with one hand shading his eyes, crouching to inspect hoofprints in the dirt. He was utterly unself-conscious, too focused on his work to notice her artistic attention. By the time they returned to the house for lunch, Mariah's feet ached and her stomach growled, but she felt more energized than she had in months. Sarah had prepared a hearty stew with fresh bread, and they ate on the porch where a breeze provided relief from the midday heat. Did my brother bore you with too many details about fence posts and water tables? Sarah teased. Not at all, Mariah said honestly. It's fascinating seeing how everything works together. You've both built something really impressive here. Tell that to Lucas when he's worrying himself sick over the books, Sarah replied. He's convinced we're always one bad season away from ruin. That's called being realistic, Lucas protested. You remember what happened to the Morrison Ranch last year after that drought? We're not the Morrison Ranch, we plan better. Sarah turned to Mariah. See what I deal with, constant worry. But the affection between the siblings was obvious, the kind of bond forged through shared hardship and mutual reliance. Mariah felt a pang of longing. She'd always wanted a sibling growing up, someone to share the burden of her father's periodic absences and her stepmother's cold distance. After lunch, Sarah enlisted Mariah's help in the kitchen, teaching her how to make the preserves that Lucas had praised. They worked side by side, cutting fruit and stirring pots, conversation flowing easily. Sarah talked about her hopes to expand the garden, maybe start selling produce in town, and how she was courted occasionally by young men from Parowan, but hadn't found anyone who made her want to give up her independence. Not that marriage has to mean giving up independence, Sarah clarified. But the men around here tend to expect a wife to be ornamental, not actually contribute to running things. I've worked too hard on this ranch to become someone's decorative housewife. That's very progressive of you, Mariah said, impressed. Practical, more like. Lucas needs me, and I'm not going anywhere unless I find someone who understands that. She grinned. What about you? Anyone waiting for you in California? No, Mariah said simply. There was someone in Kansas, but he made it clear he wasn't interested in marrying a woman with no dowry and uncertain prospects. I suppose I dodged a bullet there. Definitely. If a man can't see your worth beyond your financial situation, he's not worth your time. Sarah tasted the preserves, adding a touch more sugar. You know, you're welcome to stay longer than just until your wagon is fixed. We have plenty of room and I'd enjoy the company. The offer was tempting, dangerously so. Mariah had been so focused on getting to California, on reaching her aunt's house and figuring out her next step, that she hadn't considered alternatives. But the warmth of this household, the beauty of the landscape, and yes, the intriguing presence of Lucas Reeves made her wonder if she was rushing toward a future that might not be better than what was being offered here. That's very kind, Mariah said carefully. I'll think about it. That evening, after a dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables, Lucas invited Mariah to sit on the porch and watch the sunset. Sarah had excused herself to write letters, leaving them alone with the fading light and the sounds of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. I looked through more of your sketches today, Lucas said, settling into one of the rocking chairs his father had built. You really do have exceptional talent. Have you ever tried to sell your work? A few times. Local commissions mostly, portraits and landscape pieces. But it's not exactly a reliable income, especially for a woman traveling alone. Mariah sat in the chair beside him, grateful for the evening coolness. My aunt wants me to find respectable work in Sacramento, maybe as a shop girl or a seamstress. That seems like a waste of your abilities. Not everyone values art as much as you apparently do. Lucas was quiet for a moment, watching the sky turn shades of orange and purple. My mother used to sketch. Nothing as skilled as your work, but she enjoyed it. She'd sit out here in the evenings and draw whatever caught her eye. After she died, I found boxes of her sketches in the attic. Pictures of all of us, of the ranch as it grew, of wildflowers and birds and ordinary moments she wanted to preserve. His voice grew rough. I'm glad she did that. Those sketches keep her alive for me in a way photographs don't quite manage. Mariah's throat tightened with emotion. That's a beautiful way to remember her. Art matters, Lucas said firmly. Maybe not everyone understands that, but the people who create it and the people who appreciate it know its value. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered, and Mariah felt something shift between them. The easy camaraderie of the day had deepened into something more complex, something that made her aware of every breath, every small movement. When Lucas finally stood to light the porch lantern, their eyes met, and the intensity in his gaze made her heart race. We should head inside, he said, his voice slightly rough. Early morning tomorrow. Mariah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she prepared for bed that night in the cozy guest room, she admitted to herself what she'd been trying to ignore all day. She was attracted to Lucas Reeves. Not just to his appearance, though he was certainly handsome in a weathered, genuine way, but to his competence, his passion for his work, his obvious love for his sister and his land. He was everything the men she'd known in Kansas weren't: solid, purposeful, and deeply rooted in
This
something that
story was
mattered.
posted on the
It was
channel The Rusty
dangerous to feel
Saddle.
this
Please
way.
do not repost it in
She
any
was leaving
form.
in a day or two, continuing to California, starting a new life that had no room for a Utah rancher. Letting herself develop feelings would only lead to heartache. But as she drifted off to sleep, her last thoughts were of Lucas's hands gentle on the stallion's neck, of his profile against the sunset, of the way his rare smile transformed his serious face into something luminous. The next day followed a similar pattern. Lucas worked, and Mariah shadowed him, sketching constantly. She drew the ranch hands at their tasks, the chickens scratching in their yard, the way afternoon light slanted through the barn's gaps. But increasingly, her focus returned to Lucas. She couldn't help it; he was endlessly fascinating to watch, moving through his world with quiet confidence. He seemed to enjoy her presence too, explaining things without being condescending, asking her opinion on ranch matters as if her perspective actually mattered. When she suggested a different angle for a new fence line based on the landscape's natural contours, he studied her sketch thoughtfully before nodding. "That's actually better than what I'd planned," he admitted. "You see patterns I miss." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. They were standing close together, both looking down at her sketchbook, and Mariah was acutely aware of his proximity. He smelled like sun-warmed cotton and leather, and when he reached out to point at something in her drawing, his arm brushed against hers, sending electricity through her entire body. Lucas seemed to feel it too. He stepped back abruptly, clearing his throat. "I should check on the cattle in the upper pasture. It's a bit of a ride. You're welcome to come along if you want, or stay here with Sarah." "I'll come," Mariah said immediately. They saddled 2 horses, Lucas choosing a gentle mare named Honey for Mariah. She hadn't ridden much, but Honey was patient with her inexperience, following Lucas's horse with steady reliability. The ride took them into higher terrain, where the air grew cooler and the views more spectacular. Mariah could see for miles the ranch spread below them, the town of Parowan in the distance, mountains rising in every direction. "This is breathtaking," she whispered, afraid to break the spell. "This is why I stay," Lucas said simply. "No matter how hard it gets, moments like this remind me I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." They found the cattle grazing peacefully, and Lucas dismounted to check them over with a practiced eye. Mariah sketched the scene, but her mind was racing. She'd been thinking about Sarah's offer to stay longer, turning it over and over in her mind. The practical part of her said to stick with the original plan, get to California, settle with her aunt, find stability. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger since she arrived at this ranch, whispered that maybe stability wasn't about reaching a predetermined destination. Maybe it was about finding a place where you fit, where your presence mattered. "Lucas," she said before she could second-guess herself. "Sarah mentioned I could stay longer if I wanted to. Would that really be all right with you?" He turned to face her, surprise flickering across his features. "Of course. You're welcome here as long as you want to stay. I just don't want to be a burden or create awkwardness or..." Mariah. He walked over to where she sat on Honey, looking up at her with those sage green eyes. "You're not a burden. Having you here has been." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's been really good. You bring something different to this place. Sarah's happier than I've seen her in months, and I enjoy your company." The last admission seemed to cost him something. Mariah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I enjoy your company too, very much." They stared at each other for a long moment, and Mariah could feel the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. Lucas reached up, his hand hovering near her knee where it rested against Honey's side, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth. "Stay," he said quietly. "At least for a while. Figure out what you really want instead of just following someone else's plan." It was the most direct he'd been since they met, and the vulnerability in his expression made her decision. "Okay, I'll stay." The smile that broke across Lucas's face was like sunrise, transforming everything. "Good. That's really good." They rode back to the ranch in a state of heightened awareness, everything feeling more vivid and significant. When they arrived, Sarah took one look at them and grinned knowingly but didn't say anything, for which Mariah was grateful. She needed time to process what was happening, what she was feeling, what staying might mean. That evening, after another of Sarah's excellent dinners, Mariah wrote to her aunt explaining that she was delaying her arrival. She kept the explanation vague, needed more time to earn money for the journey, making connections that might prove valuable, but as she sealed the envelope, she acknowledged the real truth. She was staying because of Lucas Reeves and the possibility that had sparked between them. The days turned into a week, then two. Mariah fell into the rhythm of ranch life, helping Sarah with household tasks in the mornings and spending afternoons following Lucas around with her sketchbook. She learned to gather eggs without startling the chickens, to identify different plants in the garden, to read weather signs in the sky. Her hands grew more calloused, her skin more tanned, and she felt stronger than she ever had in Kansas. Lucas taught her to ride properly, and they took longer expeditions into the surrounding territory. He showed her a canyon with ancient petroglyphs carved into red rock walls, a hidden spring where wildflowers grew in impossible profusion, a ridge where eagles nested. Each place felt like a gift, a piece of himself he was sharing with her. They talked for hours during these rides, about everything and nothing. Lucas told her about his childhood in Missouri, about the decision to come west, about dreams he had for the ranch's future. Mariah shared stories about her father, about learning to draw from her mother before she died when Mariah was 10, about feeling trapped in her stepmother's house with no clear path forward. "You always had a path," Lucas said. "You just couldn't see it yet." Sometimes it takes losing everything to figure out what you actually need. The truth of his words resonated deep in Mariah's soul. She'd thought losing her home and her father and her security was the worst thing that could happen. But that loss had freed her to discover the ranch, the landscape. The man currently riding beside her with his face turned toward distant mountains. One afternoon in late June, they were working together to repair a section of fence damaged by a fallen tree. The work was hot and dusty, and they'd stripped down to basics, Lucas in just his shirt and vest, sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms, Mariah in her simplest dress with her hair tied back with a bandana. She was handing him tools and holding boards steady while he hammered, their movements coordinated and efficient. "You're getting good at this," Lucas commented, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'm learning from an excellent teacher." He smiled, that rare, full smile that made her stomach flip. "You're also just capable. Some people never develop the knack for this kind of work, no matter how much instruction they get." They worked in companionable silence for a while longer until the fence section was secure. Lucas tested it with his weight, nodded in satisfaction, then turned to find Mariah watching him with an expression she didn't bother to hide anymore. "What?" he asked softly. "I'm happy," she said simply. "Right here, right now, I'm genuinely happy. I haven't felt that way in a very long time." Lucas's expression shifted, becoming intense. He stepped closer, and Mariah's breath caught. They'd been dancing around this for weeks, the attraction growing more undeniable by the day, but neither had made a definitive move. "Mariah," he said, his voice rough. I need to be honest with you about something. All right. When I first saw you on that ridge sketching my ranch, I thought you were beautiful. But I meet beautiful women
This
occasionally,
story
and it
was
doesn't
posted on the
usually
channel
affect
The
me
Rusty
much.
Saddle. Please do not
He ran
repost
a
it in any
hand through his
form.
hair, clearly uncomfortable with emotional declarations but pushing through anyway. But then I got to know you. I saw your talent, your resilience, your kindness to Sarah, the way you approach everything with curiosity and grace. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about you as a temporary guest and started imagining you as something permanent. Mariah's heart felt too large for her chest. Lucas, let me finish, please. He took a breath. I know you were planning to go to California. I know you have a life waiting for you there, and I have no right to ask you to give that up. But I have to tell you how I feel because I'll regret it forever if I don't. I'm falling in love with you, Mariah. Maybe I've already fallen. And if there's any chance you might feel the same way, I want you to know that you have a place here. Not as a guest, but as part of this ranch, part of my life, permanently. Tears sprang to Mariah's eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. You're asking me to stay, really stay. I'm asking if you'd consider making a life here with me. I know it's fast, and I know ranch life is hard, and I can't offer you luxury or ease. But I can promise you a partner who will respect your talent and your independence, who will work beside you to build something meaningful, who will love you with everything I have. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Draw your life here, Mariah, not just on paper, but for real, with me. The echo of his original invitation, transformed into something infinitely deeper, undid her completely. Mariah closed the distance between them, reaching up to cup his face with her work-roughened hands. I already started drawing my life here the moment I came down from that ridge. And yes, Lucas, I feel the same way. I love you too. The kiss that followed was worth every difficult mile of the journey that brought her here. Lucas pulled her close with a desperate tenderness, and Mariah melted into him, tasting sun and salt and promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I was so afraid you'd say no, he admitted. I was so afraid you'd never ask, she replied, and they both laughed, the sound bright with relief and joy. They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, and Sarah took one look at their faces before letting out a whoop of delight. Finally, I was wondering how long you two would dance around each other before someone made a move. You knew, Mariah asked, blushing. Everyone knew, Sarah said, laughing. You two have been making eyes at each other for weeks. The ranch hands have a betting pool on when Lucas would finally work up the courage to say something. Lucas groaned. Wonderful. My love life is entertainment for the hired help. Your love life was painfully obvious to everyone except apparently you two, Sarah corrected. She hugged Mariah tightly. I'm so happy. I was worried you'd leave, and I've gotten used to having you around. It's going to be wonderful having a sister. We haven't talked about marriage yet, Lucas protested, though his hand tightened on Mariah's. Oh, please, it's inevitable now, Sarah said pragmatically. Might as well start planning. They spent the evening on the porch, talking about the future in concrete terms now that feelings had been declared. Lucas wanted to marry her as soon as possible, but he was conscious of propriety and what people in town might say if they rushed. I don't want anyone thinking less of you, he said seriously. We should do this properly with a courtship period and a proper wedding. How long of a courtship period? Mariah asked, tracing patterns on the back of his hand. A few months. Long enough that people can't accuse us of being impulsive, but not so long that I lose my mind waiting. He grinned at her. I've already waited 29 years to find you. I don't want to wait longer than necessary to make you my wife. They decided on a September wedding, giving them 3 months to prepare and to establish their relationship publicly in Parowan. Mariah sent another letter to her aunt, this one explaining that she'd found opportunity and love in Utah territory and wouldn't be coming to California after all. She felt a twinge of guilt about changing her plans so dramatically, but it was overwhelmed by certainty that she was making the right choice. The summer passed in a blur of happiness. Lucas courted Mariah properly, taking her to Sunday services in town, to socials and barn dances where they introduced her as his intended. The community welcomed her warmly, especially when word spread about her artistic talent. She started taking commissions, drawing portraits and landscapes for families in Parowan, building a small income of her own. Lucas involved her in every aspect of the ranch, asking her opinion on decisions large and small. He valued her perspective, treated her as an equal partner even before they were married. Mariah flourished under his respect and encouragement, feeling more like herself than she ever had. One evening in late August, they rode out to watch the sunset from the ridge where they'd first met. Mariah had brought her sketchbook, though she spent more time looking at Lucas than at the landscape. "I come up here sometimes and remember how nervous I was to approach you that morning," Lucas said, settling beside her on the rocky outcrop. "You looked so absorbed in your drawing, so peaceful. I almost rode away without saying anything." "I'm glad you didn't." Mariah leaned against his shoulder. "My whole life would be different if you hadn't invited me closer." "Our whole lives," he corrected, wrapping an arm around her. "I'd still be going through the motions, focused only on work, not letting myself want anything more. You woke me up, Mariah." She turned to kiss him, slow and deep, and marveled at how natural this felt, how completely right. They stayed on the ridge until stars began to appear, talking about their wedding plans, about what they wanted their life together to look like, about dreams both practical and impossible. "I want children eventually," Lucas said quietly. "If you do too." "No rush, but I think you'd be an amazing mother." "I'd like that," Mariah agreed, "though I also want to keep drawing, keep taking commissions. Of course, we'll figure it out together. That's what partners do." The wedding took place on a perfect September morning in Parowan's small church. Sarah had transformed the building with flowers from the garden, and Mariah wore a simple but elegant dress of cream silk that she'd worked on for weeks with Sarah's help. As she walked down the aisle without a father to give her away, she'd chosen to walk alone, claiming herself rather than being given. She saw Lucas waiting at the altar with an expression of such love and awe that tears pricked her eyes. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They spoke traditional vows but added their own promises to support each other's dreams, to face hardships together, to build a life of meaning and purpose. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas's kiss was tender and reverent, and the small congregation erupted in applause. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and more food than seemed possible for such a small gathering. The ranch hands had cleaned up and looked uncomfortable in their Sunday best, but they toasted the couple enthusiastically and teased Lucas about being domesticated now. Sarah cried happy tears and welcomed Mariah officially as her sister, and several women from town approached Mariah to commission artwork, their seal of approval cementing her place in the community. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, Lucas pulled Mariah away from the crowd for a private moment. They stood near the garden, watching their wedding celebration continue without them, wrapped in each other's arms. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "Happier than I knew was possible," Mariah answered honestly. "I keep thinking about the day my wagon broke down outside Parowan. At the time, it felt like just another disaster in a string of disasters. But it brought me here to you, to this life. I'm grateful for every difficult thing that happened because it led me exactly where I needed to be. I'm grateful for every moment that brought you to that ridge with your sketchbook, Lucas replied. My stubborn, talented, beautiful wife. My solid, passionate, deeply good husband, she returned and kissed him thoroughly. Their wedding night was spent in the foreman's cabin that Lucas had expanded and renovated over the summer, transforming it from a simple shelter into a real home. He carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests, and they made love with the tenderness and passion of two people who'd found each other against all odds, who knew the value of what they'd built together. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Mariah moved completely into the cabin with Lucas, setting up a dedicated space for her artwork in the best-lit corner.
This story
She
was posted
continued
on the
helping
channel The
Sarah
Rusty
with
Saddle.
household
Please do
tasks,
not
but
repost it in
also
any
took on
form.
more responsibility for the ranch's business side, keeping meticulous books and helping negotiate sales. Her artistic skills proved valuable in unexpected ways. She designed a brand for their cattle that became recognized throughout the territory, and her detailed maps of the property helped with land management decisions. Lucas had always been hardworking, but Mariah noticed he made more time for rest and enjoyment after they married. They took regular rides into the surrounding wilderness, and she filled sketchbooks with landscapes and wildlife, building a body of work that eventually earned her a reputation beyond Parowan. A gallery in Salt Lake City agreed to display some of her pieces, and they sold well enough to contribute meaningfully to the ranch's income. But more than professional success, Mariah treasured the daily intimacy of married life. She loved waking up beside Lucas, learning the patterns of his breathing and the way he always reached for her even in sleep. She loved the quiet evenings when he'd read aloud while she sketched, their bodies touching companionably. She loved how he made her laugh with dry observations, and how seriously he took her opinions. The first winter was challenging, with heavy snows and bitter cold that tested everything they'd built. But working together to keep the ranch running, to protect the cattle and maintain the structures, only strengthened their bond. When a particularly bad storm trapped them in the cabin for 3 days, they made the most of the forced closeness, talking for hours, making love, planning for spring. I never felt trapped during that storm, Mariah said as they finally ventured out into a world transformed by snow. With you, even being snowed in felt like adventure. That's because you're fundamentally optimistic, Lucas replied, helping her navigate a deep drift. You see possibility where other people see obstacles. It's one of the things I love most about you. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, and with it came new projects. They expanded the cattle operation, adding another pasture and improving their breeding program. Sarah's garden grew more ambitious, and she began selling produce regularly in town, her income adding to the ranch's stability. The three of them worked as a cohesive unit, each contributing their strengths, supporting each other through challenges. In late summer, Mariah realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks but waited to be certain before telling Lucas. When she finally shared the news, they were working together to fix a gate latch, and he nearly dropped his hammer in shock. "Truly?" he asked, his voice breaking with emotion. "Truly," she confirmed, laughing and crying at once. "We're going to have a baby in early spring." Lucas pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt wetness on her neck where his face pressed against her. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with tears. "I'm going to be a father." "You're going to be an amazing father," Mariah corrected. "This child is so lucky." They told Sarah that evening, and she immediately began planning, talking about converting a section of the cabin into a nursery, knitting tiny garments, preparing for the new addition. Her excitement was infectious, and Mariah felt surrounded by love and support as her body began to change. Pregnancy suited Mariah. She felt strong and capable, continuing to work actively on the ranch well into her third trimester. Lucas was simultaneously protective and respectful of her autonomy, hovering without smothering, offering help without insisting. When she continued to ride horses into her 5th month, he worried but didn't forbid, trusting her judgment about her own body. "You're going to be one of those mothers who teaches her children to be fearless," he observed one evening as she sketched, her swollen belly making it difficult to reach the paper comfortably. "I'm going to teach them to be thoughtful," Mariah corrected. "Fear has its place, but so does courage. They'll need both to thrive out here." "They'll have the perfect example in you," Lucas said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. Their son was born on a blustery March morning in 1880, with Sarah acting as midwife and Lucas pacing anxiously in the main house until he was summoned. The labor was long and difficult, testing Mariah's strength, but when she finally held her squalling son, every moment of pain evaporated into pure joy. "He's perfect," Lucas breathed, touching the baby's tiny hand with one careful finger. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Jacob Thomas Reeves, after Lucas's father and one of the ranch hands who'd become a close friend. Jake, as they called him, had his mother's blonde hair and his father's eyes, and from the beginning he was alert and curious, studying everything with intense focus. Parenthood transformed them both in unexpected ways. Lucas became even more patient and gentle, his natural protectiveness channeled into caring for his small family. Mariah discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, managing the physical demands of nursing and caring for an infant while still contributing to ranch work and her artwork when possible. Sarah was a devoted aunt, taking Jake for hours at a time so Mariah could rest or work, singing to him and telling him stories even though he was far too young to understand. The ranch hands treated the baby like a collective nephew, and it wasn't uncommon for Mariah to find Vicent rocking Jake to sleep or Tom carving a small toy horse for the nursery. Life was exhausting but rich with meaning. Mariah sometimes thought back to that morning on the ridge, when she'd been a lost young woman sketching a distant ranch, and marveled at how far she'd come. She'd found not just a home, but a purpose, a partner, a family that extended beyond blood to include everyone who worked this land together. When Jake was 6 months old, Mariah finally had time to create a large-scale painting she'd been planning since arriving in Utah. It depicted the ranch as seen from that original ridge, but with additions: Lucas working with horses, Sarah in her garden, ranch hands mending fence, and in the foreground, Mariah herself with baby Jake, both looking toward the life unfolding below them. She called it Drawing Life, and when she showed it to Lucas, he stared at it for a long time without speaking. "This is what you saw that first morning," he finally said. "Not just the buildings and the land, but the life we were creating. You captured something I couldn't have articulated." "I captured what drew me closer," Mariah replied, slipping her arm around his waist. "What made me want to draw my life here too." The painting became her most acclaimed work, eventually displayed in galleries throughout the territory and beyond. But Mariah treasured it most for what it represented: the transformation of a distant view into an intimate reality, of observation into participation, of solitude into belonging. The years that followed were marked by steady growth and deepening bonds. Jake was joined by a daughter, Emma Rose, 2 years later, and then another son, Samuel, 3 years after that. The cabin was expanded multiple times to accommodate their growing family, eventually becoming a substantial house with enough room for everyone. Sarah eventually married a kind schoolteacher named Michael Brennan, and they built a house on the property, close enough to maintain their partnership, but far enough for privacy. Sarah's children and Mariah's children grew up together, more like siblings than cousins, running wild across the ranch under the watchful eyes of multiple adults. The ranch prospered, gaining a reputation throughout Utah
This story
territory
was
for
posted on
quality
the
cattle
channel
and
The Rusty
horses.
Saddle. Please do not repost it
Lucas's
in any
careful
form.
management and Mariah's business acumen combined to create consistent success, weathering the inevitable bad years with the cushion of good planning. They employed more people as they expanded, always treating workers fairly and creating a culture of mutual respect that made their ranch a desirable place to work. Mariah's artistic career flourished alongside her family responsibilities. She developed a distinctive style that captured the essence of Western life with both beauty and honesty, and her work found eager audiences. She never became famous in the traditional sense, but she built a solid reputation and generated meaningful income, proving that art and practical life could coexist. But success and growth were never the point, not really. The point was the life they built together, the love that deepened with each passing year, the children who grew strong and confident, the land that flourished under their care, the community they became integral parts of. One evening, 15 years after that first meeting on the ridge, Lucas and Mariah rode out together to watch the sunset from their original spot. It was a warm June evening, and they'd left the children with Sarah, seizing a rare moment of privacy. "I never get tired of this view," Mariah said, leaning against Lucas as they sat on the familiar rocks, "though it's evolved quite a bit." The ranch below had changed dramatically: more buildings, larger herds, expanded gardens, but still maintaining the harmony with the landscape that had first caught her artistic eye. "Everything evolves," Lucas replied, his arm secure around her. "But the foundation stays solid. That's what matters." "Do you ever wonder how different life would be if you hadn't ridden up that morning to investigate the strange woman sketching your ranch?" Mariah asked. "All the time," Lucas admitted. "And then I thank whatever force in the universe made me curious enough to approach you, brave enough to invite you closer." He kissed her temple. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Mariah corrected. "The best was asking me to draw my life here too." "Fair point." He smiled, that full, radiant smile that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "Though really, I think you were always going to draw your life here. I just gave you the invitation to start." It was true, Mariah realized. From the moment she'd seen this ranch from afar, something in her had recognized home. The journey from observation to participation, from outsider to integral member of this family and community, had been inevitable. Lucas had simply been wise enough to see it and brave enough to name it. They sat until stars emerged, talking about their children's future, about dreams for the ranch, about maybe traveling someday to show their kids more of the world beyond Utah territory. But no matter where they might go, they both knew they'd return here, to this land they'd cultivated together, to this life they'd drawn with their own hands. As they rode back to the ranch, past corrals and gardens and buildings that represented years of shared work, past the homes where their children slept safely, Mariah felt the deep contentment of someone who'd found exactly where they belonged. She'd come to this place lost and uncertain, carrying nothing but artistic talent and desperate hope, and she'd been met with an invitation that changed everything. "Come closer. Draw your life here too." She had, and in doing so, she'd created something more beautiful than any sketch or painting could capture: a life built on love, partnership, and the courage to claim her place in the world. The Wild West, with all its harshness and beauty, had become home, and the cowboy who'd found her sketching from afar had become her partner in every sense that mattered. Years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and family celebrations. Jake grew into a young man with his father's steady temperament and his mother's artistic eye, taking on more responsibility with the cattle operation while also showing promise as a photographer, the new technology fascinating him. Emma inherited her mother's drawing talent and her aunt's love of growing things, spending hours sketching plants and developing new cultivars in expanded greenhouses. Samuel proved to be a natural horseman, with an intuitive understanding of animals that made Lucas beam with pride. Mariah and Lucas aged together, their faces gaining character lines and their bodies accumulating the aches of hard physical work, but their love remained vibrant and alive. They still took regular rides into the wilderness, still spent evenings on the porch talking and dreaming, still reached for each other in the night with undiminished desire and affection. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Lucas surprised Mariah with a gift he'd been planning for months. He led her to the ridge where they'd met, and there, on the exact spot where she'd been sitting that morning, he'd commissioned a local craftsman to install a beautiful wooden bench with a brass plaque. For Mariah, it read, who saw a distant ranch and chose to draw her life here. With love, Lucas. Mariah cried, overwhelmed by the gesture's thoughtfulness. They sat on the bench together, looking down at the ranch that had grown beyond either of their original visions, and she felt the circle of her life complete itself in the most satisfying way. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand tight in his, "for seeing me that morning, for inviting me closer, for loving me exactly as I am." "Thank you for staying," Lucas replied, "for choosing this life, this place, me, for making everything better just by being part of it." They'd built something lasting, something that would continue after they were gone through their children and the land they'd nurtured. The ranch that had once been just Lucas's dream had become their shared legacy, a testament to what two people could create together when they chose partnership and love. As the sun set on their anniversary, painting the sky in spectacular shades of gold and crimson, Mariah pulled out a small sketchbook she'd brought along. She'd been sketching their life together for 2 decades now, filling countless books with images of their children, their land, the daily moments that made up a meaningful life. But this time, she drew something different. She drew Lucas as he'd been that first morning, younger, more uncertain, with his future still unwritten, approaching a young woman on a ridge. And beside that image, she drew them as they were now older, weathered by time and work, but deeply content, sitting together on their bench and looking toward the life they'd built. "Drawing life," she murmured as her hand moved across the page. "Living it," Lucas added, watching her work with the same fascination he'd shown 20 years ago. And that, Mariah thought as she leaned against her husband's solid warmth and continued to sketch, was the real magic. Not just capturing life on paper, but living it fully, bravely, with an open heart and willing hands. She'd come west expecting to start over, to survive, to make do with whatever she could find. Instead, she'd found everything: love, purpose, home, family. A partner who saw her truly and cherished what he saw. Children who would carry forward the values they'd instilled. Land that would flourish under careful stewardship for generations. She'd been sketching his ranch from afar, uncertain and alone, and he'd invited her closer. To draw not just images on paper, but an entire life rich with meaning and connection. And she'd accepted, despite the fear and uncertainty, because something in her recognized the truth of what he was offering. 20 years later, she knew beyond doubt that it had been the right choice. The only choice, really, because everything in her life had been leading to that moment on the ridge, to Lucas's invitation, to the courage to say yes to an unknown future. The Wild West could be harsh and unforgiving, but it could also be beautiful beyond measure for those brave enough to build something lasting. And Mariah and Lucas had done exactly that, built a life, a family, a legacy that would endure long after their names faded from memory. As darkness gathered and stars
This
emerged in the
story was
vast
posted
blue
on the
sky,
channel The Rusty
they sat
Saddle.
together
Please
on
do
their
not
bench,
repost it in any
surrounded
form.
by the life they'd drawn with their own hands, and knew themselves blessed beyond measure. The cowboy who'd found her sketching his ranch from afar had become her everything, and she'd drawn her life here too, exactly as he'd invited. And it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined that long ago morning when she'd been just a lost traveler with a sketchbook and fading hope. It was real and solid and deeply, permanently theirs. It was home.